For $50, a lonely cowboy bought a ranch and was shocked to find 3 Apache women waiting there. Ever since he was a boy, he had felt the pull of wide skies, the whisper of the wind across the grasslands, and the steady rhythm of a horse's hooves. Life on the prairie was hard, yes, but it was honest. He had grown up helping his father mend fences, tend to the cattle, and learn the ways of the land. Yet, despite all his skills and the many years he had spent riding from town to town, Jack had never owned a piece of land that was truly his own. For years he had worked odd jobs. One month he would help a rancher round up stray cattle, the next he would fix fences for a farmer who needed extra hands. Sometimes he took work in the small towns that dotted the plains, hauling supplies, tending stables, or guiding travelers across rough terrain. Jack earned enough to get by, but he always felt like something was missing, a place to call home, a patch of earth that he could shape, nurture, and protect. The idea of owning a ranch had been a dream ever since he could remember. One chilly morning, with the sun just beginning to cast golden light across the horizon, Jack sat at the small wooden table in his modest rented cabin. He sipped his coffee, the bitter taste warming him, and scanned the local newspaper for anything promising. His eyes wandered from one advertisement to another, most of them ordinary or far too expensive. Then, almost hidden among the listings, something caught his eye. It was a small ad typed in plain letters: "Ranch for sale, very low price. Remote location. Call for details." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He read it again, making sure he hadn't imagined it. The price? $50. $50 for a whole ranch. It seemed impossible. His first instinct was skepticism. How could a ranch with land and perhaps a house sell for so little? There had to be a catch. Maybe the land was poor, or perhaps the previous owner had left in a hurry. Maybe it was far from town, with no water or electricity. Jack didn't know, but the seed of curiosity had already been planted. By the afternoon, he had packed a few belongings onto his horse and set out toward the ranch's location. The journey was long, winding through dusty trails, over small hills, and across dry streams that reflected the late afternoon sun. Jack felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Every mile brought him closer to the unknown, and every mile reminded him that this could change his life forever. He imagined what it would be like to ride across land that was his own, to plant crops, raise cattle, and perhaps build a home that could one day shelter more than just himself. As he approached the ranch, the landscape began to shift. The plains opened into rolling hills, dotted with scrub brush and hardy grasses that swayed gently in the breeze. A lone fence stretched across the horizon, old and weathered but still standing. Jack's heart raced with anticipation. He spurred his horse forward, eager to see what awaited him. The ranch house came into view, a small but sturdy wooden structure with a sloping roof. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, curling into the sky like a quiet signal of life. Jack slowed his horse, studying the scene. The house looked lived in, yet abandoned in a way that made him uneasy. There was no sign of people, just the gentle sway of a clothesline and the faint footprints near the door. He dismounted, tying his horse to the post, and approached cautiously. The air was still and quiet, except for the soft creak of the porch boards under his boots. Jack stepped inside the house, expecting it to be empty. The interior was simple: bare wooden floors, a few old chairs, and a small kitchen with pots and pans stacked neatly on a shelf. It was clean, surprisingly so, as if someone had cared for it recently. Jack ran his hands over the counter, imagining the life that could be lived here. He pictured mornings spent tending animals, evenings by the fire, and nights under the endless stars. He walked outside again, exploring the surrounding land. The ranch was modest, maybe 50 acres in total, with patches of grassland, a small orchard, and a corral that had clearly seen better days. Jack knew that with work he could restore the fences, cultivate the soil, and even expand the garden. For $50, this was a treasure, and the thought made his chest tighten with excitement. The dream he had carried for so long was suddenly within reach. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack sat on the porch, letting the calm of the land wash over him. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known for years. The loneliness that had followed him across the plains seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the thrill of possibility. This ranch, humble and quiet, was the start of something new. Yet, even in that moment of calm, a small part of him wondered what he hadn't yet seen. The ranch felt alive in a way that was almost mysterious, as if it held stories waiting to be discovered. Jack didn't know who had lived here before, what their lives had been like, or what secrets the land might hold. But he was determined to find out. With a deep breath, he made a promise to himself. He would take care of this land, respect it, and make it his own, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Night fell, and Jack built a small fire outside the house, the flames dancing in the dark. He cooked a simple meal, listening to the sounds of the plains, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of grass in the wind, the occasional flap of wings from a night bird. He felt alive in a way he hadn't felt in years, connected to the earth and the endless sky above. For the first time, he truly believed that he had found a place where he could belong. As he lay down under a blanket, staring up at the stars, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this ranch was more than just land. It was a beginning, a chance to build a life full of purpose, discovery, and perhaps companionship. Little did he know that the ranch held surprises he could never have imagined, people, stories, and experiences that would challenge him, teach him, and ultimately change the course of his life forever. The $50 purchase had seemed like a gamble, a simple act of hope. But as Jack drifted to sleep under the vast, open sky, he sensed that this was the start of something extraordinary, a story that was just beginning, with twists, lessons, and encounters that would leave an imprint on his heart for years to come. Jack Harris woke the next morning, feeling rested, but also a little uneasy. The ranch was quiet, almost too quiet. The previous day, he had explored the land and felt a thrill at owning it. But now, as he stepped outside to check on the corral and the small orchard, he noticed something that made him pause. There were signs of life he hadn't seen before, footprints in the soft earth, fresh smoke curling from the chimney, and the faint sound of voices carried on the wind. Curiosity and caution mixed in his chest. Jack had expected the ranch to be empty, perhaps abandoned for years. He had imagined solitude, freedom, and hard work without interruption. But now it seemed that someone, or perhaps more than one, was already here. His hand instinctively rested on the handle of his pocket knife, not because he felt threatened, but because he didn't know what to expect. As he approached the porch, he saw them clearly for the first time. 3 women stood there watching him. They were tall and strong, with eyes that held a mixture of curiosity, caution, and pride. Their skin was sun-kissed from the outdoors, their hair long and dark, and their clothing reflected a connection to the land, practical, yet adorned with simple decorations that hinted at culture and heritage. Jack stopped in his tracks, unsure how to greet them. For a moment silence hung between them, broken only by the soft rustling of the wind through the grass. Jack cleared his throat. "Hello," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm Jack Harris. I bought this ranch recently." The women exchanged looks, whispering softly to one another in a language Jack did not understand. He could tell they were deciding how to respond, and he tried to convey through his body language that he meant no harm. He lifted a hand in greeting, smiled gently, and continued, "I didn't know anyone was living here. I hope I'm not intruding." Finally, the tallest of the 3 stepped forward. She had a quiet strength about her, and when she spoke, her words were measured and calm. "This land has always been part of our people," she said, speaking slowly in English so Jack could understand. "We have lived here for a long time. It is part of our life, our history." Jack felt a mix of emotions. He had bought the ranch, but clearly it was not empty. There was a history here he had not considered. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I understand," he said. "I don't want to cause trouble. I didn't know anyone was here. I thought the land was abandoned." The woman's eyes softened slightly, though her posture remained strong. She introduced herself as Naomi, and the other two women as Alina and Sita. They were members of the Apache tribe, descendants of families who had lived in this region for generations. The ranch, they explained, had been part of their ancestral land. Their families had cultivated the small gardens, hunted in the surrounding hills, and maintained the house long before it came up for sale. Jack listened intently, realizing how little he truly knew about the land he had purchased. He had been so focused on finding a bargain and fulfilling his dream that he had not stopped to consider the history, the people, or the lives tied to this place. Now faced with these women and their quiet strength, he felt both a sense of awe and a twinge of guilt. I don't know what to say," Jack admitted. "I never expected this. I bought the ranch thinking it was empty." Naomi studied him carefully, then nodded. "You have money and you have papers," she said. "But this land is not just land. It carries stories, and those stories belong to people who lived here long before you arrived." Jack felt the weight of her words. He had thought owning the ranch meant freedom and independence, but now he realized it came with responsibility he hadn't anticipated. He looked at the three women, standing tall and proud, and wondered how he could honor their presence while still pursuing his dream. The initial tension between them was thick. Jack wanted to assert his rights, but he also wanted to do the right thing. The women were wary of outsiders. They had seen many people come and go, often taking land or resources without thought. Jack knew he had to tread carefully, showing respect without appearing weak. Over the next few days, Jack tried to find a balance. He introduced himself properly, offered to help with chores, and began learning about the land from the women. Naomi, Alina, and Sita were cautious but willing to teach him. They showed him where the water ran deep, which areas of soil were fertile, and how to tend the small gardens that had sustained them. They taught him to track wildlife, find herbs for healing, and understand the rhythms of the land. At first, Jack felt awkward. He was used to being self-reliant, handling work alone, and making decisions quickly. Now he had to slow down, observe, and listen. He stumbled over small tasks, misread signs in the landscape, and sometimes felt frustrated at his own mistakes. But the women never mocked him. Instead, they guided him patiently, correcting gently and explaining their methods. Jack began to see the value in their knowledge, not just for survival but for understanding the land itself. Slowly, a tentative trust began to grow. Jack shared his own skills as well. He helped repair fences, mend tools, and manage the small herd of cattle that wandered the hills. He carried firewood, repaired the roof, and learned how to keep the house warm during chilly nights. The women noticed his effort and commitment, and while they remained cautious, they began to include him in decisions about daily work. One evening, after a long day of labor, Jack sat around a small fire with Naomi, Alina, and Sita. The sky above was painted in shades of purple and orange, and the first stars began to appear. They shared stories, some from their own lives, some from the history of their families, and some about the land itself. Jack listened in awe. He realized that this ranch was not just property. It was a living story, filled with generations of knowledge, struggle, and survival. For Jack, the experience was humbling. He had expected solitude and simplicity, but what he found was complexity and connection. He began to see the land not just as something he owned, but as something alive, with its own history and spirit. He understood that respecting the women's presence was not a limitation. It was an opportunity to learn and grow. Despite the challenges, Jack began to feel a sense of belonging he had never known. The initial shock of seeing the three women had given way to curiosity, respect, and even admiration. He realized that they were not obstacles, but guides, living reminders of the deep connection between people and the land. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of work, learning, and shared meals became the foundation of an unusual but meaningful relationship. Jack learned to read the signs of weather, to anticipate the needs of animals, and to cultivate the soil with care. The women, in turn, began to appreciate his dedication, his willingness to learn, and his respect for their traditions. By the end of the first month, the ranch no longer felt like just a purchase. It was a shared space, alive with history, stories, and new possibilities. Jack's dream of owning land had transformed into something richer. He realized that the true value of the ranch was not measured in dollars, but in the knowledge, connection, and life that already existed there. Jack often reflected on the unexpected turn of events. He had set out seeking independence and freedom, but what he found was community, wisdom, and the challenge of honoring a past he had never known. The three women had changed his perspective, showing him that land was never just land. It was life, history, and legacy combined. As he lay in his small bed at night, listening to the distant sounds of the plains and the faint murmur of voices from the porch, Jack felt a sense of peace. He knew the days ahead would not always be easy. There would be disagreements, learning curves, and moments of tension. But he also knew that the journey had just begun, and that the surprises, lessons, and connections he would encounter would be worth every challenge. The ranch, bought for $50, had already given him far more than he had expected. A connection to people, to history, and to a land that was alive in ways he could never have imagined. And Jack knew. Jack Harris had never felt more aware of his own limitations than he did in the weeks following his arrival at the ranch. He had expected some challenges, fences that needed mending, a roof that leaked in the rain, a garden overgrown with weeds. But he had not expected the subtle, unspoken challenges that came with sharing the land with Naomi, Alina, and Sita. These women were proud, skilled, and deeply connected to the land in ways Jack could barely understand. Their presence reminded him daily that he was not alone, and that the ranch was not simply a blank canvas for his dreams. At first, misunderstandings were common. Jack had grown up with certain ways of doing things, practical, quick, sometimes rough. The women had methods honed over generations, careful, patient, and attuned to nature. He would dig a hole for planting crops only to be told, gently but firmly, that the spot he chose was wrong, that the soil was too dry or too close to the roots of existing plants. He tried fixing a fence using nails and boards he thought were strong, only for Naomi to shake her head and show him a technique that would make it last through winter storms. Jack felt frustrated at times, thinking, "I know how to do this," but he quickly realized that his pride had to take a backseat to learning. The women, on the other hand, were wary. They had seen outsiders come and go, often bringing destruction or disrespect. They had every right to be cautious. Even when Jack showed willingness to learn, there were moments when their silence or sharp glances reminded him that trust had to be earned. It was not enough to own the land on paper. He had to prove through action that he respected its history, its caretakers, and the lives intertwined with it. One particularly tense morning, Jack attempted to corral a small herd of cattle that had wandered close to the orchard. He tried to herd them quickly, shouting and waving his arms, thinking speed was necessary. Naomi appeared beside him, her hands on her hips, and calmly but firmly stopped him. "Slow down," she said. "They are scared. If you move too fast, you will lose control and the cattle will run." Jack paused, breathing heavily, and watched as she stepped closer to the animals, moving with a quiet confidence that seemed to calm them. He realized then that experience and understanding of behavior were more important than force. He followed her lead, and together, they guided the cattle back into the pen without incident. That day, Jack learned a lesson he would carry with him for months. Patience and observation often mattered more than speed and strength. Evenings were the hardest. After a long day under the sun, Jack would often retreat to his small corner of the porch, weary and quiet. The women, however, would gather around the fire, preparing meals with care, tending small patches of herbs, and speaking softly to one another. Sometimes they included Jack in their conversations, teaching him words from their language, explaining traditions, and sharing stories from their families. At first, he struggled to follow, not understanding the deeper meanings behind their words. But slowly, he began to listen not just with his ears, but with his heart, realizing that much of their communication was carried in tone, gesture, and respect for nature. Jack also began to notice the subtleties of the land that the women revered. Alina pointed out which plants were safe to use for medicine, which herbs could soothe a headache or heal a small cut. Sita taught him how to read the clouds and the wind, predicting storms before they arrived. Naomi showed him where water was pure and plentiful, where traps for wild animals were set, and how to move quietly across the hills without startling deer or coyotes. Jack was amazed at how much knowledge was embedded in their routines, how connected they were to the land, and how much he still had to learn. But it wasn't all smooth progress. Misunderstandings flared up. One afternoon, Jack accidentally stepped on a small patch of herbs Sita had been cultivating. She watched in silence, her face a mixture of surprise and disappointment. Jack apologized immediately, explaining that he had not seen them. Sita shook her head, not angry, but letting him feel the consequences of his carelessness. Jack realized that respect was not just about words, it was about mindfulness, attention, and honoring the work and traditions of others. Slowly, trust began to grow. Jack showed that he was willing to listen, to adjust, and to learn from mistakes. He stopped rushing tasks, paying attention to detail, and asking questions when he was unsure. The women, in turn, began to include him more actively, offering guidance rather than instruction, and allowing him small responsibilities. Jack found satisfaction in these small victories, realizing that progress was not measured by speed or size, but by the steady growth of understanding and cooperation. One rainy afternoon, Jack helped repair a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm. As he worked, he and Naomi spoke quietly about life, family, and the challenges of the past. Jack shared stories of his childhood, growing up on the plains, his father's lessons about hard work, and the dream of owning land. Naomi listened carefully, sometimes nodding, sometimes offering small insights. He realized then that this ranch was not just a place to live, it was a meeting point of histories, cultures, and experiences. Meals became another opportunity for learning and bonding. Jack had been used to simple, quick dinners, beans, bread, and whatever he could cook over a fire. The women prepared meals that were simple yet nourishing, using ingredients he had never worked with before. They taught him to prepare stews with roots and herbs, to bake bread in small, outdoor ovens, and to preserve fruits for the colder months. Sharing these meals became a ritual, a time for conversation, laughter, and the slow building of familiarity. Over time, Jack noticed subtle changes in himself. His impatience lessened. He became more aware of his surroundings, noticing patterns in the weather, in animal behavior, and in the land itself. He began to value teamwork over solo effort, understanding that cooperation often produced results far greater than working alone. Perhaps most importantly, he began to feel a sense of humility, realizing that his $50 purchase had brought him far more than property. It had brought him a chance to learn, grow, and connect with people who had a wisdom he could never have found on his own. There were moments of laughter, too. Alina had a mischievous sense of humor and often teased Jack when he fumbled with a tool or mispronounced a word. Sita would sometimes challenge him to small contests of skill, like stacking firewood or catching a chicken that had escaped. Jack, though initially embarrassed, learned to laugh at himself and enjoy these moments, realizing that connection was built not just on work, but on shared experiences and simple joy. By the end of the first season on the ranch, a quiet rhythm had emerged. Jack and the women had developed a working system, dividing tasks, sharing responsibilities, and learning from one another. The land began to show signs of improvement. Fences were stronger, the garden grew healthier, and the livestock were well cared for. More importantly, the relationships between Jack and the women had grown stronger, built on trust, respect, and a shared sense of purpose. Yet, Jack knew the journey was far from over. He still had much to learn about the land, about patience, and about understanding people whose lives and histories were intertwined with the earth in ways he could only begin to imagine. Each day brought new lessons, challenges, and surprises, and he embraced them all, knowing that his dream of owning a ranch had transformed into something far more meaningful, a life enriched by connection, culture, and discovery. Jack often reflected on the unexpected turn of events. What had begun as a simple purchase for $50 had become a journey of personal growth. The women had taught him to see beyond ownership, beyond dreams of independence, and to appreciate the living, breathing story of the land and its people. They had reminded him that respect, humility, and patience were as important as skill, effort, and ambition. As night fell over the ranch, Jack would sometimes sit alone on the porch, listening to the wind whisper through the hills and the soft murmur of voices from inside the house. He felt a deep sense of gratitude for the women's presence and guidance, knowing that the lessons he learned here would stay with him for the rest of his life. The ranch was no longer just land. It was a classroom, a home, and a bridge between worlds he had never truly understood before. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Jack Harris no longer feared it. He had found that true growth often came from unexpected places, from challenges that pushed him beyond what he thought possible, and from people who refused to let him ignore the depth of history, culture, and life around him. He had bought a ranch, but he had discovered something far more valuable: the power of connection, understanding, and shared purpose. As the weeks turned into months, the rhythm of life on the ranch began to change. Jack Harris had grown accustomed to the presence of Naomi, Alina, and Sita, and the initial tension that had accompanied his arrival had softened into a quiet understanding. He no longer felt like an intruder. Instead, he felt like a partner, someone learning from the land and from the women who had nurtured it for generations. Each morning, the ranch came alive with movement and purpose. Jack would wake before sunrise, the cold air crisp against his skin, and help feed the animals in the corral. The cows and goats had become familiar to him, each with their own quirks and personalities. Naomi often worked beside him, her hands steady as she guided the animals to their pens. Alina and Sita would tend to the garden, planting seeds, watering rows of vegetables, and checking the small orchard for signs of pests or disease. Jack had once thought he would be alone, dreaming of independence, but now he realized the satisfaction of shared work. The cooperation between them grew stronger each day. Jack discovered that certain tasks required teamwork. Repairing fences became faster and easier when 3 extra pairs of hands were involved, especially when Naomi showed him techniques to reinforce posts against the wind. They cleared brush together, stacked firewood for the coming winter, and built new enclosures for the livestock. Jack found that by working side by side, laughter came easily and the bond between them deepened. There were still challenges. Differences in opinion sometimes caused disagreements, though none were severe. Jack preferred a practical, straightforward approach, while the women often emphasized patience and observation. One afternoon, while planting a new section of the garden, Jack suggested digging quickly to cover more ground. Naomi shook her head, her expression patient but firm. "The soil needs to rest between rows," she explained. "If we rush, the plants will not grow well." Jack grumbled under his breath but followed her instructions, and when weeks later the crops flourished, he had to admit that her method had been better. Jack also began learning more personal details about the women's lives. Naomi had grown up on the plains, learning survival skills from her elders. Alina had a talent for storytelling, recounting legends and lessons from her family in a way that made the past feel alive. Sita, quiet and observant, taught Jack how to notice subtle changes in the weather, the wind, and even the way the animals behaved. He found himself fascinated by their knowledge, realizing that every action, every decision they made, was informed by generations of experience and connection to the land. Evenings became a time of camaraderie and reflection. The women often prepared meals, sharing ingredients Jack had never used before. They taught him how to make stews from wild roots and herbs, how to bake simple bread in small outdoor ovens, and how to preserve fruits and vegetables for months when the cold made growing impossible. Jack learned to enjoy the process, noticing the care and patience required to create food from the earth. Sharing meals became a ritual, a moment of laughter, conversation, and quiet appreciation for the day's work. On weekends, they sometimes explored beyond the ranch's boundaries. Naomi taught Jack how to track deer, identify edible plants, and read the signs of animals hidden in the hills. Alina shared stories of the land, connecting history with geography, teaching Jack to see each tree, stream, and hill as part of a larger story. Sita showed him secret spots where water pooled after rain, perfect for gathering herbs or simply resting in shade. Jack began to understand that the land was alive in a way he had never experienced. It was not merely a resource but a teacher, a companion, and a responsibility. One day, Jack suggested a small project, repairing the old barn at the far edge of the property. The roof had weakened over time, and the wooden beams had started to rot. The women agreed, seeing the benefit of improving the structure for storage and protection of animals. Together, they gathered tools, sourced lumber from nearby areas, and set to work. Jack lifted heavy beams, hammered nails, and measured lengths carefully. Naomi guided him, showing the correct angles and reinforcing methods. Alina and Sita worked on repairing the doors and reinforcing the walls. By the end of the week, the barn had been transformed, stronger and more functional than it had been in years. Jack felt a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that their combined effort had produced something lasting. Through these shared experiences, Jack also learned to appreciate the small joys of daily life. Early mornings when the mist still clung to the hills, evenings by the fire with laughter and conversation, quiet walks to check on the livestock, and moments of silence where all four simply watched the sun dip below the horizon. These became precious. Jack realized that the ranch had become more than a property. It was a living space, shaped by care, respect, and shared purpose. Trust deepened in subtle ways. The women began to include Jack in decisions he had once assumed were theirs alone. Where to plant a new orchard tree, how to rotate livestock pastures, when to harvest certain crops, all of these decisions became shared responsibilities. Jack felt honored by their inclusion, understanding that trust had been earned, not given, and that every step forward was built on respect. There were moments of humor and warmth, too. Alina would tease Jack when he struggled with a task, pretending to scold him while secretly enjoying his attempts. Sita would challenge him to friendly contests, like seeing who could stack firewood most efficiently or track a rabbit's path without disturbing it. Naomi, always practical, sometimes shook her head in quiet amusement at their antics, but even she smiled when Jack finally mastered a particularly tricky task. These moments lightened the hard work and reminded Jack that connection was built not just through labor, but through laughter and shared experience. Jack also began to notice changes within himself. He had arrived at the ranch seeking independence, but he realized that true fulfillment came not from isolation, but from collaboration and learning. He became more patient, more observant, and more mindful of the impact of his actions. Mistakes no longer frustrated him as much, because he knew that they were opportunities to learn and grow. He had become not just a ranch owner, but a student of the land, its rhythms, and the people who understood it best. One evening, as they all sat around a fire after a long day of work, Jack looked at Naomi, Alina, and Sita. Their faces glowed in the firelight, eyes reflecting strength, wisdom, and kindness. He realized how much he had learned from them, not just about ranching or the land, but about patience, humility, and connection. The initial shock of finding them on the ranch had long faded, replaced by respect and genuine admiration. "I never imagined life could be like this," Jack admitted quietly. "I thought owning a ranch meant solitude and independence. I didn't know it would teach me so much about people, about the land, about myself." Naomi smiled gently. "The land teaches those who listen," she said. "It has its own ways of showing what matters. You have learned to watch, to wait, and to care. That is more than many ever know." Alina nodded. "And you have learned that we are part of the land just as the trees and animals are. Respect for life around us is respect for ourselves." Sita, quiet as always, added, "The work we do together, the care we give, this makes the land stronger, and it makes us stronger too." Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude. The ranch he had purchased for $50 had given him far more than land. It had given him community, wisdom, and a chance to grow in ways he could never have imagined. The women had not only shared their knowledge, but also their trust, and that trust had become the foundation for something enduring. By the end of the season, the ranch was transformed. Crops flourished, fences held strong, and the livestock were healthy. More importantly, Jack and the women had built a life together, one that blended his dreams with their heritage, their knowledge, and their values. The land was no longer just a purchase. It was a shared home, alive with stories, lessons, and connection. Jack understood now that his journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more lessons, and more surprises ahead, but he no longer faced the future alone or with fear. He had found companions, teachers, and friends who would guide him, challenge him, and share in the joys and struggles of the land. And so, life on the ranch continued, shaped by hands, hearts, and stories intertwined across generations. Jack Harris had begun with a dream and $50, but he had found something priceless, a connection to people, to history, and to the earth itself, creating a life far richer than he could have ever imagined. Months had passed since Jack Harris first set foot on the ranch, and much had changed, not just in the land but in himself. What had begun as a lonely venture for $50 had grown into a life filled with purpose, learning, and unexpected companionship. The initial shock of finding Naomi, Alina, and Sita waiting on the ranch had long since transformed into deep respect and genuine friendship. Jack now understood that the true value of this place went far beyond money. It was measured in connection, history, and the living bond between people and land. Spring had arrived, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The orchard bloomed with delicate white and pink flowers, promising fruit that would nourish them for months to come. The garden thrived, with rows of vegetables stretching across the fertile soil, carefully tended by the women and occasionally guided by Jack's hands. The livestock grazed contentedly on green pastures, safe within fences that had been repaired and reinforced through their combined efforts. The ranch was no longer just a property. It had become a home, alive with the rhythm of life and care. Jack often reflected on how much he had learned. Every day brought new lessons, some practical, others far more profound. He had learned to read the sky, anticipate changes in weather, and notice the subtle shifts in the land that signaled growth or danger. He had learned patience, humility, and the importance of observing before acting. Most importantly, he had learned that respect for the land, for history, and for others was far more valuable than ownership alone. One morning, Jack rose early, the first light painting the horizon in gold and pink. He walked through the orchard, listening to the soft chirping of birds and the gentle rustle of leaves. Naomi joined him, carrying a basket for collecting fresh herbs. "The spring brings new life," she said quietly. "It reminds us that growth is always possible, even after winter's hardship." Jack nodded, understanding the metaphor not just for the land but for his own journey. He had arrived as a stranger, unsure and inexperienced, and now he had grown, guided by the wisdom and patience of the women. Together they worked through the morning, tending to crops, repairing tools, and preparing the ranch for the months ahead. Alina shared stories of past seasons, recounting the ways their ancestors had lived and survived on this land. Jack listened intently, amazed by the resilience, intelligence, and creativity embedded in their family history. Each story connected him more deeply to the land, helping him see it not as a blank slate, but as a place alive with memory and meaning. Sita, as always, had a quiet presence. She often moved between tasks with careful observation, noting small changes in the soil, the weather, or the animals. One afternoon, she led Jack to a small stream hidden among rocks and shrubs. "This water sustains life," she explained. "If we take care of it, it will take care of us." Jack marveled at the simplicity and truth in her words, realizing that stewardship of the land was not just work, it was a responsibility, a way of honoring life itself. The women began to trust Jack fully, sharing responsibilities and decisions more openly. When planning the next season's crops, they included him in discussions, asking his opinion while guiding him with their experience. Jack felt honored by their inclusion, recognizing that trust was not given lightly, but earned through respect, patience, and effort. He also began to understand that leadership on the ranch was not about authority or possession. It was about collaboration, listening, and shared vision. Jack also noticed subtle changes in himself. His once solitary nature had softened, replaced by an appreciation for community and connection. He laughed more freely, shared in small joys, and learned to value relationships as much as accomplishments. The women had taught him that life was not just about achieving goals, but about the journey, the shared experiences, and the bonds formed along the way. As summer approached, Jack and the women celebrated small victories together. The garden flourished with vibrant colors, the orchard produced its first fruits of the season, and the livestock grew strong and healthy. They built a new chicken coop, repaired the barn further, and cleared paths through the hills for easier movement. Each achievement was shared with laughter, discussion, and mutual pride. Jack realized that the ranch had become more than a place to live. It was a canvas of collaboration, where effort, care, and respect created something enduring and beautiful. Evenings on the ranch were special. Jack, Naomi, Alina, and Sita often sat around a fire, cooking meals together, sharing stories, and enjoying the peace of the plains. Jack would listen as Alina recounted family legends, the lessons woven into tales of bravery, patience, and wisdom. Naomi shared practical knowledge and reflections on life, while Sita offered quiet insights, often pointing out lessons hidden in nature. Jack had grown to cherish these moments, seeing them as a rare and valuable gift, a way to connect with people, history, and the earth in ways he had never known. Jack also took time to reflect on his own journey. He remembered the day he bought the ranch for $50, thinking it was a simple opportunity to own land and live independently. He smiled at the memory, realizing how naive he had been. The ranch had given him far more than ownership. It had given him knowledge, friendship, understanding, and a sense of purpose. He had begun as a lonely cowboy seeking solitude, but he now felt part of something larger, a living story of land, life, and human connection. The women had also shared with Jack the importance of preserving history and tradition. They explained the significance of the land, the plants, and the animals, teaching him that every element of the ranch held meaning. Jack learned to respect not just the visible aspects of the land, but the invisible, memories, lessons, and stories passed down through generations. He understood that the ranch was not just property but a legacy, and that his role was to honor it while adding his own care and effort. As the months turned into a year, the ranch had become a thriving, harmonious place. Crops were abundant, livestock were healthy, and the buildings were sturdy and functional. Jack, once unsure and inexperienced, had grown into a capable caretaker, not just of the land but of relationships and community. He and the women had learned to communicate, trust, and support each other in ways that made daily life both productive and meaningful. One autumn evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jack sat with Naomi, Alina, and Sita on the porch of the ranch house. They watched the horizon together, the plains stretching endlessly before them. Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude, realizing that the ranch had transformed him in ways he could never have anticipated. The land had tested him, the women had taught him, and together they had created something enduring. "I never imagined life could be this full," Jack said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I thought I was just buying land. I didn't know I would find teachers, friends, and a home." Naomi smiled. "The land shows its lessons to those who pay attention," she said. "You have learned much, and yet there is always more. Life on the land is never finished. It grows, changes, and teaches endlessly." Alina nodded, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sunset. "And you have learned that the people who care for it matter as much as the land itself. We are all part of this place, and together we make it stronger." Sita, quiet as always, added, "The work we do, the care we give, the respect we show, it all becomes part of the land. And part of ourselves." Jack felt a swell of emotion. He realized that the $50 purchase had been only the beginning of a journey far greater than he could have imagined. The ranch had given him lessons in patience, humility, and respect. It had given him friendship, community, and a sense of purpose. And most importantly, it had taught him that life was richer and more meaningful when shared with others, when guided by wisdom, and when approached with care. In the months and years that followed, Jack, Naomi, Alina, and Sita continued to work the ranch together. They faced challenges, the occasional storm, an animal illness, or a difficult season, but each obstacle was met with shared effort and wisdom. Jack had grown into a leader, not by authority but by example, showing care, patience, and respect. The women had grown to trust and value his judgment, and together they nurtured both the land and each other. Jack often thought back to the day he first arrived, lonely and unsure, expecting only solitude and freedom. He smiled at the memory, knowing how far he had come. The ranch had become a living story of connection, growth, and learning, a place where every day offered new lessons, challenges, and moments of joy. And at the center of it all were Naomi, Alina, and Sita, the women who had taught him that life, like the land, was meant to be cared for, respected, and shared. By the time another year passed, the ranch was thriving more than ever. The orchard bore abundant fruit, the gardens produced healthy vegetables, and the livestock were strong. The barn, fences, and other structures had been repaired and improved, reflecting the hard work and dedication of all four of them. The ranch had become a home in the truest sense, a place of safety, learning, and connection. Jack Harris had arrived as a lonely cowboy with $50 and a dream. He had found something far greater, a home, a family of friends, and a deep connection to land and life. The lessons of patience, respect, and collaboration had transformed him, and the bonds he shared with Naomi, Alina, and Sita had become the foundation of a rich and meaningful life. And as the sun set over the plains, Jack looked out across the land he had purchased, now alive with life and care, and felt a quiet joy. The ranch was no longer just property. It was a story, a legacy, and a testament to the power of learning, connection, and respect. His journey had begun with $50, but it had given him a lifetime of wisdom, friendship, and purpose.